Welcome to the Asia Briefing podcast series. Today, joining us in Hong Kong is Mr. Devonshire-Ellis, the founder of Dezan Shira Associates. Dezan Shira Associates is a specialist foreign direct investment practice providing business advisory, tax advisory and compliance, accounting, auditing, and payroll services to multinationals investing in emerging Asia. Today, Chris will be answering some important questions for American businesses to consider when entering the Chinese market. Chris, the economic slowdown in China has many people worried. What's your opinion on that?
When we're looking at headlines that China growth is slowing nationally to 7-8%, it's generally perceived as being a bad thing. For the last 20 years, the Chinese economy has been growing at rates of over 10% per annum. That's been a tremendous achievement. But as your economic base continues to grow, those sorts of growth rates become impossible to maintain. So that is just economic reality. So there is no surprise that China's GDP growth rates are starting to slow. In fact, it's inevitable. You cannot continue to grow at 10% indefinitely forever. It just isn't going to happen. So China's reached a point whereby its economy is so large that it cannot continue to grow at 10%, and we're seeing that. Nonetheless, figures of 7%, 8%, it's the highest GDP growth rate in the world. On top of that, China is also a huge country, so these figures of 7-8% are only mean averages in any event. So while that may mean that growth rates in Shanghai are lower, it does mean that other areas of China, growth rates are significantly higher. Now, if we look at the growth rates in provinces such as Sichuan or other inland provinces, then the growth rates there are hitting 12, 13, 14%. So when one talks about China on a national mean average, it doesn't really give an indication of what is happening in the country on a provincial basis. So the trick about China when it comes to understanding the much quoted slowdown figures is to understand what that really means. And first of all, it's a mathematic inevitability that is happening. But what it actually also means on a national basis, and it means that the growth in China is now coming increasingly from the inland provinces. And that's where growth in businesses that are focused on China's need to reach out to. They need to get further inland to keep hold of those high growth rates.
So you had mentioned inland and western China. What opportunities are there right now?
American companies have done a tremendous job of penetrating the Chinese market on a national basis. You know, there's significant disposable income in China's first-tier cities. Chinese consumers are now becoming used to buying American products. So the opportunity for American companies to take advantage of the massive continuing growth of China's middle-class consumers to reach out to the 700 cities that have populations of 500,000 plus, because that is where the growth is. Now, China does have excellent supply chain distribution, so it is possible to land US-made produce in China and get it out into the heartland of the country. How you do that, of course, many different options, and there are many supply chain distributors that are available to help US companies. The key to unlocking the new China is to look at what is going on in the inland regions.
So you just touched on a few of the opportunities available to American companies in China, but what are some of the main hurdles that they face when entering?
So the sorts of things where companies get into trouble are the basic things. They didn't register their trademarks. So very common, and they got into problems with that. So get your trademarks registered. Look at your intellectual property as an asset and have it protected, and that includes patents as well. Get them registered. That's what these processes are there for. And if companies ignore them, then they do so at their peril. I think getting market research that is familiar with these markets is important. An issue, I can demonstrate that. A Chinese banknote has 7 different languages on it. So if one's going to start selling goods to Inner Mongolia, then you need to have Mongolian script on your product. So market research and how local tastes and flavors, colors, what are auspicious, what will work, what won't work. Market research is also important. And although it's got to be paid for, there are firms out there that can assist, that do a good job, and it's worthwhile spending that money up front to do that feasibility study, get the market research done, so that you know how to tweak your product, which is already presumably very successful in the States, needs tweaking to sell it to China or any other market for that matter. So that's a market research question, and you need to acquire that intellect. I think the other thing is that when setting up a business, it's very important to maximize the tax structuring of that. Setting up a business in China is not just a legal procedure. It also involves a good, strong look at the tax and financial implications of that. For example, for relatively small companies, China, if you are a new company and your turnover is expected to be relatively low in the first year or two of operations, they will classify that business as a VAT small payer, which is fair enough. But being a VAT small payer means that you have to lodge an upfront bond with customs before you get your business license. Now that, although it may not be a huge amount of money, but for SMEs it can be significant, and those sorts of monies need to be incorporated into the capital injection that is required to fund the business up front. So looking at the tax implications, looking at the real costs of getting that business set up and then operational, that also needs to be had a good look at. From the advisory perspective, you need legal to look at the IP, market research to tweak your product for the local domestic markets in China, because they vary also, and you need good tax advice, and firms such as Dezan Shira do both the legal and the tax advisory and financial planning. You need those intellects in place before you start to trade, because that will make your business much more effective. It'll make it more tax efficient, it'll make it more financially viable, and with good market research on the ground, you enhance the chances of success and bring forward profitability that much sooner. So all of these are smart decisions to make, and really the boxes should all be checked off for each of those. Companies that get into trouble or don't make a success of it, or run into problems, they're the companies that generally did not do those things. So the disciplines are there, they're well known, and ignore them or cut corners and don't do them, that's a big mistake, and companies really need to be serious about China. And as I said, getting in this homework, getting hold of that intellect, and spending that money up front to make sure that their chances of success are optimized.
One thing you touched on is intellectual property rights, and this is something that a lot of American companies worry about with China. So what's the current sort of landscape for IP rights in China?
Well, it remains problematic, and there are many reasons to this, which I won't necessarily go into, but a lack of an independent judiciary. Some of what's been going on involves state companies which are supported by the government. So there are serious problems of IP protection in China. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I haven't really seen any improvement. If IP is a critical part of your business, global business, then you may want to consider, in fact, whether China is the right market for you or not. Because in my opinion, if you have IP that is valuable, or marks which are valuable, somebody will come along and try to rip you off. That will happen. So you need to be prepared. So I think what I'm trying to say is get your IP registered, get it registered in China. You have to do that. Get it registered in China, and in addition to that, you also need to have a strategic think about how damaging having your IP ripped off will be to your business, because it will happen. So what is the damage aspect to your company IP in China? And if that is likely to be a fatal issue, then don't go to China. It's as simple as that. If it's going to be a problem then that can be solved or tolerated, then okay. But I think the whole issue over IP is one of strategy, and are you prepared to deal with the hassles that IP problems will bring. So I'm afraid that is not particularly good news, but it is pragmatic, and I emphasize, please look at your strategic overview in your global arena, how important your IP is to you. Getting it ripped off, is that going to be fatal or not? how much problems are getting your IP ripped off likely to cause you, how much tolerance do you have to that. These determine as to whether China is or is not the market for you. And if it is, even in any event, you should get those patents and trademarks registered ahead of time. Domains as well, domain registrations, get all those locked in. It makes sense to get it done. It's a cost of business. It's a real cost of business, and not having it done costs much more. So it's one of those boxes to check, and you must get that done.
Finally, in relation to China and some of the surrounding countries and trade pacts, can you discuss the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and how that relates to China?
Yeah, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, is going to be the largest free trade zone in the world. It's currently under negotiation, and it includes all of the ASEAN nations, so all the Southeast Asian nations in ASEAN, so that's Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia and Vietnam. They're all in there. So it includes all of the ASEAN nations, it includes China, it includes India, and it also involves the developed Asian markets of Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. So that is a huge area. Basically, you've got pretty much most of Asia all there. What the RCEP is intended to do is to reduce the tariffs on tens of thousands of products to zero. So the impact that will have on the global supply chain will be significant. If your product falls into those agreements, which as I said are currently in the process of being negotiated, then you'll be able to manufacture that product in any of those countries and export them to any of those other countries completely duty-free. So this is good news. Trade barriers are coming down throughout the region. China is part of these negotiations, and they're set to, I think that we can expect something to happen, something concrete to happen by 2015. So that means that American companies really need to start thinking about this. The RCEP will shift the global supply chain, where you manufacture and where your markets are. These are all really good questions, and as I said, with the RCEP comprising all of ASEAN, China, India, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea, the opportunities for American companies to both sell to these markets but also manufacture and distribute throughout those markets from that region are huge. It's expected by 2015, as I said, so time now for American companies to start thinking about the implications of that and the opportunities that it presents American manufacturers selling products to those markets.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Briefing podcast series. For additional business resources, or if you would like to learn more about doing business in China, please visit our website at www.dezshira.com. We look forward to having you join us for the next Asia Briefing podcast.